My name is Reinhard, Reinhard Eckel. I'm with RapidSOS. Great to see a few well-known faces here in the audience and some new folks as well. Just give me a second until that thing is loaded here. Wonderful. All right. Before I dive into all these, ideas around leveraging next generation 911 capabilities from smartphones, just wanted to give you some context around where I'm coming from and what my background is and what the company does that I'm with, RapidSOS. Where we're coming from is not necessarily the typical public safety telecommunications vendor perspective with decades spent in a PSAP and decades spent in public safety. We come from a bit of a different area, mostly technology startups, big tech companies, and a little bit of a different angle. But when we started this, we looked at smartphones. We looked at the devices that we have in our pocket. And we just realized it's dramatic how it changed our lives over the last few years. It's dramatic what capabilities have evolved over the last few years. And it's really unthinkable how it has transformed our lives, right? We use smartphones for precise location in many different ways. We use it for multimedia. We use it for all sorts of capabilities that really have little to do with a phone. But when it comes to calling 911, when it comes to emergency communications, we reduce those functions dramatically. Most notably, and many in this room are very familiar with that, most notably we don't use the full capabilities when it comes to location. And it's sad that in 2016 we still have to talk about location when we really could talk about all the other amazing multimedia capabilities. But it's a topic that is so important that I just cannot give a presentation without talking about it, unfortunately. Also, of course, no access to health and medical data, only using the phone network, no camera, texting only if you're lucky, if you're in the right part of the country, no video, etc., right? So I'll cut that one short. I think in summary is we have these capabilities in our pocket. There's at least 20 video cameras, maybe more, in this room alone, just us carrying it around it. But we don't use it for 911. There's no photos. There's no. I could have a Fitbit on my wrist that has my heart rate, but 911 wouldn't have a chance to get it. So we as a company came together to tackle this problem. But obviously, coming into this a few years ago, we were a bit naive. We thought that we just make an app, just like Uber. You press a button, all the data is transmitted, and the ambulance shows up. Speaking of app, obviously, that's a hot topic at NINA, at the FCC, at NASNA, and I'm glad it's a topic because, while apps might not necessarily be the final solution to all of the problems, it's a great showcase of things that we could be doing and things where we get a sense of where the future is headed. So speaking of an app, I don't want to promote our product here. I just wanted to give you a sense of where my thinking comes from. We've built an app. It's called Haven. It's available on the App Store, where we try to tackle a lot of different problems that 911 has. And a lot of these problems are centered around location. So there's the problem of call routing, where we still rely on cell towers rather than the actual handset location. It relates to getting handset location into the hands of 911 call takers and dispatchers and responders, where also we still rely on network triangulation and HEPS in some instances where we really know it's not working that great. But it's not necessarily limited to location. We also try to do a lot of other things like text to 911 for PSAPs that don't have the availability, that don't have a deployment. We also have multimedia capabilities. We can send still images. We can save medical demographic data, etc. Right? But obviously, as we've learned, apps are not the final solution, and that's the catch, right? For this to work, people need to download the app and use it to contact 911. And we've taken a kind of partnership approach to that. We've formed relationships with organizations, with institutions, with universities, with insurance companies to really get the app to as many people as possible rather than going direct to consumer and building a brand. And that's worked well. So the app is a success, I would say, but the app is not the final product. I think the longer that we're doing that, the more time we spend on the app, the more we realize that this is really just a showcase. This is a showcase of what's to come. And I understand why apps have sometimes a little bit of a bad reputation in the 911 community, right? There's a lot of bad apps out there. There's a lot of app developers that don't have the resources or the endurance or the capabilities of doing it in a way that is public safety grade. You know, a lot of app developers don't take the time to go to 911 PSAPs and try to understand how it works and how the app might affect their operations, their training, their technology. And you know, I have full understanding that NASNA has expressed an interest on regulating it, because there's, I don't know how many 911 apps in the App Store, and I'm not aware of any other app other than us that actually went to NASNA, solicited the input over the years, you know, went to their annual meeting, you know, faced the lion in its own den, and you know, stood up there and you know, faced the criticism and took the feedback. So that's something that you just cannot expect. And a lot of 911 apps come out of college hackathons or, you know, people with very good intentions. But 911 is a complex beast. And there's more than 6,000 911 PSAPs in this country alone. And getting data in there is tricky. So we did it in a way that integrates with legacy E911 systems, where at least the location piece and the voice, which are the two most important pieces, get transmitted through legacy systems. And you know, Fletch, I share your distaste about the alley, but it's what we got. So we learned to use how to use every single character in that legacy format the hard way over years of testing. And unfortunately, it's a small correction. It's unfortunately not 30 characters everywhere. I discovered LE formats that only have 20, so you never know. But either way, enough about apps. I think, how do we get multimedia and more into the PSAP, right? That's the topic. But before we talk about multimedia, I want to revisit location just a little bit, but I'll make it quicker because I know we're running out of time. So if we look at the location services that smartphones have today, location services that are used by apps like Google Maps or Uber or even Pokemon Go, you know, uses all the same location services. Why is it that this is more accurate than what 911 currently gets from the carriers, right? So we use cell towers, you know, that's very reliable, it's very well understood. It works well, but it's unfortunately not very accurate. It also uses GPS, which in an outdoor environment is highly accurate and, you know, really helps us to get an accurate location fix. Unfortunately, when it comes to indoor environments, the GPS is not as useful as people hoped it would be. So device-based hybrid location providers supplement that with Wi-Fi access points. And you all know that Google and Apple, as parts of their terms of services, basically get user consent to share location back and forth. Every time your phone hits a Wi-Fi access point, even if you're not connecting, just seeing that Wi-Fi access point gives Google and Apple more data around where your phone is located. So over the years, they've built up an enormous crowdsourced database that is very accurate for indoor location. Likewise, Bluetooth beacons. Unfortunately, I missed the talk about indoor location earlier today due to some travel complications, but I'm sure Bluetooth beacons were part of it, that will be part of the puzzle. But it is really a puzzle. For location, there's not one location source that solves it all. The magic comes when you combine it. The magic comes with what some people call device-based hybrid location, where you combine the different sensors based on the circumstances and based on the environment, and then you get the most accurate location fix. And carriers currently don't use that today. Carriers today use mostly cell tower triangulation and GPS to some extent. Very hopeful that carriers will start to use device-based hybrid. At least one of them I heard will use it very soon, but it's something that everybody should be doing. And with the app, we kind of showed a way to get there sooner, and I'll talk about a way to do it without the carriers getting around to do it. But with better location, what do I mean? I mean it's faster, it's more accurate, and it has an ability to update more dynamically. And the update piece is important as well. Sometimes we only think about technology issues, but really there's operational issues as well. And in the PSAP legacy environment of today, often updates don't happen unless a call taker presses a repeat button, and then hopefully a few seconds later you'll get an update. So I'll skip over that. Just kind of to emphasize the point why location is important, and why I'm still talking about location even though we're all more excited about multimedia. Location is at the centerpiece of the problems that 911 is facing, right? If you look at all these call recordings of people that cannot verbally explain where they're located, they might not know a civic address, they might be in transit, they might not even know the intersections, and they're just not used to a world anymore where they have to explain verbally where they are. You know, if you can order a pizza from Domino's without knowing your address, you can order an Uber without knowing your address. Yet when it calls to coming 911, you know, that's the first question. And there's very, very disturbing audio recordings out there listening to callers that struggle to explain where they are. The other case, domestic violence, it's obviously a big problem for 911 dispatchers, and I have a lot of respect for folks who work in a 911 PSAP, and that's for me the hardest piece, is listening to callers that are physically assaulted and are actively in danger and being assaulted, and not being able to send help because they don't know where they are. So that's a big problem with 911. Obviously, kidnappings, abductions, you know, all of that. You know, this is probably a well-informed audience, so I don't have to explain a lot of details around that. Just to wrap up on location before I move more onto multimedia and additional data, it's no longer required to have a smartphone application to get this device-based hybrid location. Smartphone operating systems like Google have implemented a solution already on their Android operating system, which enables them to send device-based hybrid location out when an emergency call is placed. So rather than me asking a customer or asking a citizen to use an app to call 911, a user can just dial the digits 911 and the location is sent in the background over an IP channel. Unfortunately, the feature is still dormant in the United States. None of the carriers has currently agreed to receive that data, and we'll see how that evolves over time. But the concept of an additional data repository that Fletch has explained earlier today, and the concept of a location information server, which are all NINA i3 elements. You know, there's a lot of i3 bashing going on, but some pieces of it we can use. You know, that certainly will play a role there. So I'll explain a little bit later how that's going to fit in once we tie it together with multimedia and additional data. But just to finish that chain of thought, so for Google devices, the ability to send device-based hybrid location is already there. It's just nobody's receiving it today. And for other smartphone manufacturers, AML might not be the solution. They might have a different path how they want to do it. So we as a company offer what we call the beacon service, which is an alternate pathway for a similar type of service, just a little bit of more bells and whistles around it, and a little bit more additional data capabilities as well, in addition to just location. So how could this look like in a PSAP for location? Just imagine getting a big circle from your carrier location, and then getting a small circle from your device-based hybrid location. And this is meant to be in a computer-aided dispatcher's map or in a call-taking map. This is not meant to be a web browser that you launch as a separate application. This is not meant to be a URL that they need to click to. This is meant to be natively integrated into the software that's already running into the PSAP. So I'll show a few examples of what that might look like. But if you think of it, if you have an IP-based connection from a smartphone into the PSAP's customer premise equipment, then there's a lot more that you can do. You're not limited to location. You can do all sorts of additional data and multimedia as well. So this is essentially the same thing that Fletch showed earlier today. We don't want to wait until all this legacy voice infrastructure is replaced, and you couldn't have, you couldn't have said it better. There are entities in this industry that make a lot of money with the way things are currently run, and maybe there's a lack of incentives for them to move off this world where you charge by the record and where you charge by every routed call. And that's something that we as a tiny startup cannot really influence. But what we can do is we can say we're not going to wait for all of this to be replaced. We're going to find a way around it. And I don't like to use the word over the top because some 911 folks have hesitations. But now that it's been said so many times earlier today, and nobody had a problem with it, I might as well go there. So all we need is a hook in the PSAP, a modification in the customer premise equipment or in the CAD to query over the top. And we can use NINA i3 functional elements for the data delivery. We can use the conveyance mechanisms that are written in the standard, like a PID flow for location, like XML vcards for the additional data repository, like the EIDD. All of this can be used. It's just used in a different way. We don't wait for a world until we can dereference URIs from a SIP header, because frankly, that's not happening in 2016. Instead, we just modify the CPE or CAD in the PSAP so that they can fire a request to an additional data repository and then display all the data natively I got too excited. Display all this data natively in the computer-aided dispatcher CPE system. So it's essentially the same concept that Fletch, you were explaining, but the difference is that it is not a URL that needs to be open in the browser. It's basically just using the calling party's phone number, the callback number, as a query key to query a generic additional data repository, and that could be ours, that could be anybody else's, really, using the same NINA i3 mechanisms that were written in the standard, using the same conveyance mechanisms so that you don't have to do it all over again for every single provider, and then getting the data in. And getting data in means additional enhanced location and more. And I'm kind of sorry that I really, that I really emphasize location so much, because it's a problem that we shouldn't have to deal with. But I spend way too much time with 911 folks, and that's just still on their mind. So that's the first problem we need to solve before we can even move on to multimedia. Yes.
Reinhard, if the IP path becomes a primary path, would you, in a perfect world, want to see prioritization? Would you want to see prioritization given to 911 packet-based communications over that IP path? And if the answer is yes, would QoS be enough to provide the prioritization you're looking for?
I think most importantly, the voice needs to have prioritization, right? So the core NINA, the NINA core services, like a SIP call and basic location, either by value or by reference, that needs to have priority on the network. Supplementary data, maybe not. Maybe commercial grade is enough, as long as it's encrypted.
So for voice, would the assigning at a higher QoS level, a 20 instead of a 30, be sufficient to ensure that that prioritization was recognized across an IP fabric of potentially multiple providers?
Yes, but if we're talking about voice transmission, we're not talking about over the top anymore, right? When we as, and I can only speak for myself, when we as RapidSOS look at NINA i3 voice, we basically look at sending a SIP call from a session border controller to a border control function, and it's all it's all well defined in the standard. It's just that most ESI nets are not willing or are not able to receive pure i3 SIP calls with location in the header or with a reference in the header. I hope we'll get there sooner than later. And I think if I had given the same presentation a year ago, I might not have talked about over the top as much. I would have said, well, we're just an NG911 originating service provider. We don't even need to consider the E911 network. That's going away anyway. But it seems like there's a certain stickiness. And that stickiness of the legacy network, I think, has to do with funding, has to do with the fragmentation of PSAPs and the lack of technology capabilities in some of these entities, has to do with financial incentives for the companies that run the E911 infrastructure. There's a lot of things at play, right? And I think we'll have to prepare for a transitional environment where E911, or where voice is over E911, and maybe carrier location is over E911, but we just transmit whatever we can over the top in a way that is natively integrated into the call taker's experience in the PSAP, right? That doesn't necessarily require them to go to an unknown third-party website, which may or might not be whitelisted on their firewall, et cetera, right? There's a lot of considerations here, and I wish I could say this will all go away in a year and we'll do pure I3. Unfortunately, I don't think so. So,
Real quick, you said you didn't like the term over the top. I'd be interested to hear what you call it.
Well, of course it's over the top. I've just learned how to avoid the term because some 911 people are allergic to it.
Gotcha.
But yes, of course it's over the top.
Because it's under the bottom on your drawing.
Yeah. But I think the main concept is that we don't. Over the top sometimes has the notion of something being proprietary and something being opaque and something being a very regional level. Like, there's a lot of app companies out there, and while they were developing their application, they go to one PSAP and they successfully convince one PSAP to do a trial running a web browser in their PSAP, and then they make a press announcement saying they've solved 911, right? That's how over the top is perceived, and that's not who we want to be. So that's why but yeah, it's just nomenclature. Yes, Bill?
Just as a quick follow-up, do you need me to use mine?
Please, yeah, because for the rest of the world.
Yeah, so 2 seconds, right, just to close off on both of you guys. I mean, what's over the top and what's primary depends upon, again, Admiral Simpson just alluded to it in his comment, and anybody could from looking at the picture, right? It depends upon which channel eventually becomes primary. What's over the top. I remember over the top and there's carrier people in the room, that's a carrier legacy term, right? And that was even somewhat of a derogatory term, were things that went over the IP channel on the device that they couldn't control, right? So, yeah. So I mean, but if that is what becomes primary, because we can't get, because of the work you're very well aware of from TPOPA, and stealing a little bit of thunder from the afternoon presentations, right? Until the funding gets right, until everything else gets right, if some of these other paths do become primary, I mean, I hope there's a lot of people in this room who are working not only Next Gen 911, but are also very familiar with FirstNet, right? And if this doesn't resemble what's happening with FirstNet, then shame on everybody, right? Because there's been a lot of heat and a lot of light about FirstNet, but at the end of the day, what's FirstNet delivering? It's a data-only network. Voice for mission-critical public safety voice is still land mobile radio, right? And I would say that even if I didn't work for Motorola, right? I mean, that's just the way that it is. And so we're looking potentially at this same sort of hybrid system here, right? So again, it goes back to the comments I made 2 sessions ago or whenever I said that. The quicker the IP networks get in place, the more these become moot points. Without that IP transformation, I had a jurisdiction, one that actually was mentioned earlier today, I won't say which one it was, at NINA last week asked me, hey, I'm going up in front of my board. I need to know, it's great all these theoretical discussions, but I never hear anybody talk practically. Where do I need to start? What's the first thing I should build? If I need to do 7 things, but I can only afford 1, which one is that? And there may be people in the room who disagree with me, that's fine, because it's just my opinion. But I said, your first thing is, if you can only afford to do 1 thing, build out the IP network, build out the ESINet. If you don't have the ESINet, if you don't have the IP connectivity into all your centers, all of this is just a bunch of us talking to each other in a mutual admiration society. Nothing's actually going to move. But once you get that in, then that question about OTT versus primary path becomes somewhat moot. Now it's like whoever can get the PSAP, the data that they need to do their job better, wins, in my humble opinion.
I think that's a great summary. I think we're running a bit short on time, so I'll show 2 more slides or 3 and then just wrap it up, make sure we have a break before the next session. So obviously location is just the beginning. Additional data, multimedia is really where it's going over time. There's a lot of use cases for that. come see me afterwards. You want to talk through that. I want to be mindful of time here. Just a few examples of what this could look like in a PSAP natively integrated into call taking or CAD. So this is an example of a 911 CPE, a demo that we've shown at APCO and NINA this year at the big trade shows. Location plots natively on the 911 map from 2 different sources. And additional data and multimedia is essentially one click away. So it's similar to what we heard earlier about the kind of, is it push or is it pull? Is it solicited or unsolicited? Obviously, multimedia is probably better if it's solicited, so the call taker can choose to go to that tab or not. Another example here, same concept. This was with a GIS mapping provider. We plot the location on the map and put a little camera icon next to it. If the call taker hits the camera icon, we connect to the video camera of the smartphone, right? If you can do it with traffic cameras, if you can do it, the San Bernardino example of, the Chamber of Commerce encouraging small businesses to provide their camera feeds, we all have a camera feed on us, so we can spin that thought a little bit further. It's the same thing, just even more dynamic and mobile cameras that could follow a suspect if you want to think a little bit in dramatic terms. One more example. Doesn't have to be in the CPE, can be in the CAD as well. That's a computer-aided dispatch system where we've done an integration. Same thing, you get better location, additional data. There's a photo stream in here, and this can pull data from all different apps through the additional data repository, and ultimately also directly from any smartphone, as long as there's a hook on the smartphone device, just like with AML or the beacon service I was talking about. So skip over that. Next generation 911 is going to do all of that, but we cannot wait for it to be done. So the summary is we'll have to do something transitional in the meanwhile. We'll have to use next generation 911 concepts and mechanisms in a creative way. So I'm not going to dismiss the I3 standard. We're following it to the T, but in a different way that was originally anticipated. So thanks for bearing with me. I know you're all eager to take a break. I'll be around all afternoon, so happy to chat if you want to learn more. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Reinhard.